Um, Schisms. Well, the way religions start is that somebody, somewhere, at some time, has an experience of divinity, and then they share it. And somebody else finds it to be compelling. And so that person that finds the story of the person who purports to have an experience of divinity, that person pays the sharer the highest compliment possible. They call their version of what they experienced as truth, and they adopt it as the lens through which they see the world. What I said there, it made sense, but it was kind of a lot packed into some short sentences, or one long sentence, so I'm going to say the whole thing again. But listen up, Buttercup. Here we go. Somebody somewhere at some time has an experience of divinity. That does not make a religion. That just means somebody experienced divinity. If that person shares it on some level, they write about it, they talk about it, they inscribe something on a stone tablet, it's not, that detail is not important. But they communicate it or they share it. And then somebody else hears that or sees that version, that story of this first person's purported experience with the divine, and they find it to be compelling and moving, and so much so that they call it truth. And they adopt it as the lens through which they view the world, and you just had the birth of a religion. Did you guys follow that? Think about it. Whether it's Abraham or Moses, you have the Abrahamic or Mosaic tradition, which is really a fancy term for Judaism. And then once you've got that established parent tradition, and sometimes there's different evolutions of that. So you get little offshoots, little nuanced subsets, subsects. But then sometimes there's a big divide, the great divide of the Eastern and Western Church, which took place in the 11th century. You read about that? So sometimes there's a great divide. And that great divide is a schism. Now, one woman's schism is another man's revival movement. Let me say that again. There's inevitably going to be little bits of drift and the refocusing and re-emphasizing of this or that detail over something else, and sometimes even some substantial revision as time goes on. But sometimes it's a big division. People really start to see things differently. And then that becomes a schism. But one person's schism is another person's revival movement. Let me give you an example. In Judaism, had like any number of different evolutions. There were vegan Jews that said that the Hebrew Bible, I don't know how much you guys know about the Hebrew Bible, including you guys, to be honest. The Hebrew Bible recommends these fancy, ornate, somewhat detailed, ritualized animal sacrifices. Are you guys aware of this? Like considerable detail, like how to cut off the limbs and how to bleed things out and what mantras to chant and what you can eat and what you can't and how you kill this animal versus that animal. And are you guys aware of this? At least like in like passing you're aware of it. But it's quite, if you look at the Hebrew Bible, there's considerable detail into how exactly the killing is done. So there were Jews, a couple thousand plus years ago, around the time of Jesus, a little bit before, and they stopped killing animals. There were Jews in the Hebrew Bible itself that stopped killing animals, because there's this text in the book of Hosea that says that my belly is filled with burnt offerings and I will accept them no more. They used to actually build fire sacrifices and burn the animals, and that was the gig. So I guess my belly is filled with burnt offerings and I will accept them no more. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. That's a statement in the book of Hosea 6:6. It's some kind of devilish statement. And that was quoted by Jesus. Jesus himself quoted that in Hebrew in the New Testament to his flock. Did you guys follow that? Jesus, of course, was a practicing Jew who knew the Hebrew Bible and worshipped at a synagogue. You following this? Okay, so prior to Jesus, there were Jews, even in the Hebrew Bible, and then also, around the Levant and that area, a couple thousand plus years ago, prior to the time of Jesus, that had stopped killing animals, and they would make effigies of animals out of paper mache, and then they would sacrifice those instead of killing an actual animal, and they would say that they were supposed to be sacrificing their animal-like desires, and that's what the Bible really meant. That your animalistic desires are what was meant to be sacrificed, not actual animals. Do you guys follow this? They were Jews. They get like the Dead Sea Scrolls and those texts discovered in Qumran, and you could there's like these cults, these vegetarian Jewish cults. Their writings are there, and their interpretation of the Hebrew Bible and what was really meant and what was really the essence of the faith, and how the Jews of that time, the Orthodox Jews of that time, had gone off track and they missed the important lessons. Even Jesus himself said, my Father had 10 commandments and I have 2. This is in the New Testament. So you can see a revival movement. My Father had 10 commandments, I have 2. I'm going to distill down and essentialize the most important details, or not details, the most important principles of our tradition. You guys have gotten lost. Let me make it easier for you. Love God with your whole heart. Love your neighbors yourself. So Jesus was a revivalist Jew from the Nazarene or Essene sect, depending on what you want to follow in the Bible. If you look at his initiation through baptism, that's an Essene practice, the bathers. And then you've got the Nazarene sect, which he's identified with in the book of Acts. This is probably way more detailed than you guys need, but he's identified with these 2 Jewish subsects that were involved in a revival movement. It wasn't that big of a deal that they had to be completely thrown out of Judaism as apostates and as a heterodox teaching, which just basically means you deviated so far that we're going to reject you. You're no longer a Jew. You guys following this? So then, Jesus was a revivalist Jew who worshipped in a synagogue, studied the Hebrew Bible, and was doing the same kind of revitalization and reviving that was common at that time in various sects of Judaism, and people were dealing with it. But he made enough of a stink, or his followers made enough of a stink, that then they became a whole different religion, and that religion is called Christianity. Things got weird enough and contentious enough, and they divorced themselves enough from the mainstay of Judaism, which they're no longer considered to be Jews, they're Christians. They also claim to be part of the Abrahamic faith, and the rules of Mosaic law are listed in the book of Acts, and which ones a Christian follows and which ones they don't. And the whole circumcision thing became a big deal because you got a bunch of older men converting to Judaism, and now it's like, do you have to cut off part of my penis or not? Like, what does it take in order for me to be part of the tribe? It's one thing if you're mutilating my genitalia and I'm too young to complain. It's another thing if somebody's like 35 and they convert to Judaism, and the price of getting initiated that you got to cut off the tip of your penis. It's like, that's a pretty big commitment, right? You know what I mean? It's like small. It's like, it's like cutting off your earlobe, but a whole lot worse. Like a whole lot more painful with, maybe like you don't see it here, but it's like, it's unnecessary surgery. There's a whole history with circumcision, which I don't know that, we need to get into, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's not the temple, and it's like our ashram, and so I can get a little more, I can play a little more fast and loose here. Kellogg, the guy who makes your cornflakes, that guy was really into promoting circumcision because, and he's quoted as saying, he wanted people to associate pain with their genitalia from a young age, so they would be more likely to be chaste later on in life. And so he promoted circumcision with his vast wealth from the breakfast cereals and such that became extremely popular around the turn of the century. And they have basmati flakes in India? Super good. They stay crunchy for a long time in milk. You can get basmati flakes in India. I kid you not. I'm not making this up. I promise. I'm not kidding. Google it afterwards and you'll see it. It's a real thing. He said it was cleaner and more hygienic and led to less diseases. It's just totally fallacious. There's no evidence to support this. There's no benefit to cutting off part of your penis. It's not like I just decided we should remove all their fingernails because it's cleaner. You know what I mean? We're going to cut off ears because it's cleaner. It's like, that's literally what's equivalent of. It's like the ultimate malpractice mutilation that somehow or other is ordained. Literally it's ordained and it's approved of. It makes no sense whatsoever. It's genital mutilation. But he promoted it because he said it was cleaner and better for health and more hygienic. And again, that's just not true. But his real motivation was he wanted people to associate pain with their genitals from a young age, which I also don't think is true. I also think that's quack science. I don't think there's any evidence that if you take a 1-year-old and without anesthesia slice off part of his penis, that he's going to remember that and be more chaste later on in life than if he didn't. I don't think there's any evidence to support that. Anyway, the vast majority of people in the U.S. a generation or two ago were circumcised. It's changing now because people are just thinking, what? Are you kidding me? What the hell's wrong with everybody? And if you zoom out, it's all over the U.S. they engage in ritual genital mutilation because of, Mosaic law going back many thousands of years. It was even not that big of a deal when they were Christianizing Jews. They even decided it wasn't an absolute essential thing. There were 4 things you had to do. You had to not eat strangled animals, not fornicate, which means sex outside of marriage, not eat blood, and not eat animals off pagan altars. 3 of this is in the book of Acts, chapter 15, the book of Acts, where it lists the 4 rules that you absolutely have to follow. It's when all the original 12 apostles got together and debated what were the core features of Judaism that you just couldn't get rid of. 3 of the 4 had to do with minimizing the consumption of meat. But circumcision didn't make the list. So clearly it's a non-essential detail, and somehow or other it got promoted and it made it, just like 40, 50 years ago, it was the norm. It's gradually changing. I'm not going to ask for a poll of who's circumcised or not. Just it's too weird for even me to go there with you guys. But younger people will be less likely to be circumcised. I mean, you can look at the statistics. Younger people are less likely to be circumcised, and older people are way more likely to be circumcised. It was the gold standard up until a few decades ago. So yeah, Jesus was a revivalist Jew following the laws of Moses, but his followers diverted enough from the Judaism of their time, even the avant-garde and esoteric Judaism of their time, that they got called a different tradition. This, by the way, has nothing to do with my class. This is just an intro. But we'll do a little. We'll get there. We'll meander there in just a minute. And so we think of Judaism and Christianity as totally different traditions, but the actual reality is so much of Christian philosophy comes from Judaism. And so although Judaism is the Abrahamic and Mosaic tradition, the reality is that Christianity, although it differs on huge things, they still keep a fair bit of Mosaic and Abrahamic law because they just didn't bother to rewrite it, and they just built on the work of their predecessors. Like, for instance, all the admonitions against idol worship, all the Christian hatred of idol worship, right? All that stuff, it's all from the Old Testament. There's nothing in the New Testament about it. All the philosophy behind it, the graven images and so on and so forth, that's all from the Jews and the Babylonian Ishtars and Baals and Ishtars that they were rising up against. Judaism is really, in essence, it's the rise of monotheism and the polytheistic culture. The Babylonian culture and Egyptian culture that was polytheistic, and the Roman culture for that matter. And Greek culture, that whole part of the world was polytheistic. And Judaism was the rise of monotheism, that there's one ring to rule them all in that milieu. So they had to explain what they didn't like about idol worship and polytheism, and then that was just inherited by the Christians. They didn't bother rewriting any of that New Testament, they just quoted from it. So much, like I said, of Christian philosophy, you just end up going back to the Old. That's why they had the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is the Hebrew Bible, the majority of it, translated into Greek in a book called the Septuagint, which is then translated into whatever language you're reading it in. But the Old Testament is the majority of the Old Testament is entirely the majority of the Hebrew Bible. There are some books that got left out. Septua is like septa, 7 in Sanskrit. Siete in Spanish. And so the Septuagint. A septuagenarian is like a 70-year-old, so it's the same term. 70 scholars are known to have translated the text. They're said to have translated the text independently, and they all translate in the same way, from Hebrew into Greek, and therefore it became. Greek was a language of philosophy at that time, and so you would render text into Greek. The Bible itself was written in Greek because it was the language of philosophy at that time. So if you're going to write a serious work, you would write it in Greek. Now the Muslims, they also try to claim that whole Abrahamic thing, but it's really, truly and honestly just marketing. When you look at Christianity and Judaism, you find there is so much actual borrowing, but Islam is really a different religion. They took the name Abraham, and they had some stuff like that they took, and the Archangel Michael and a few other things like that. They took some of those items, but they reimagined them in a way which divorced them entirely from Christianity and from Judaism. But because they were ministering to Jews and Christians and trying to convert them to Islam, there was a benefit in saying that, we're like you guys. Does that make sense? So Islam is really its own thing. But they also claim that we're part of the Abrahamic tradition. But they're just from the Middle East. Really, that's the only thing they have in common with the other two traditions. It's all Middle Eastern Semitic religion from that small part of the world, these warring tribes. And for all these traditions, there's a whole concept, it's like a radical dualism. There's God and the devil, there's good and evil, although the devil doesn't exist in Judaism, but there's good and evil, there's God and the devil, you're in or you're out, you're a Jew or a goy, I'm a Christian or a heathen, a Muslim or an infidel, you're either with us or against us. It's all like very Bedouin, very tribal, very heaven and hell, right or wrong. It's not monistic, that everything's coming from a similar source. Even the Christian conceptions of the world was created ex nihilo, from nothing. Therefore, the world has nothing to do with God. Therefore, the world is mammon, it's bad, it's evil. And so, this gives rise to things like millenarianism, where you have a cult of people that just want to die and have a flood, a deluge, or a trial by fire, and get back to that place. You find that like with the Branch Davidians, the Heaven's Gate cult, and you find it all over the world, this really heavy hatred of the world and this radical dualism where the world becomes an accident or the work of the devil, and the goal is to get away from this world. You can't wait to get martyred. You're volunteering for that kind of stuff. It's one of the children of radical dualism. You start to hate a massive piece of reality. No, man, I'm riding the mobile class. Sorry. But I'll get you at the end. Sometimes I'm like on a roll, but sometimes it's cool, but not right this minute. With dualism, you end up having a whole chunk of stuff which is fundamentally bad, which is fundamentally wrong, fundamentally evil, fundamentally malevolent, which is truly antagonistic to and opposite to God. And it presents a serious problem in some sort of holistic worldview, because you end up having to reject and condemn. And there's a whole chunk of the world, like Eastern traditions, which just never did that. Everybody was borrowing from each other, and it was much more of an inclusivistic society, and society was not these massive civil wars and warring factions. And from a sociological perspective, the religion there reflects the values of that culture, which was inclusion. And so if you look at India, which never suffered the civil war, never had slavery, only slaves in India were brought in by the Muslims. They had indentured servants, but they didn't have anything like what we would consider slavery, like what was existing in this country even 150 years ago. Chattel slavery, where you own people's property. That monistic worldview, where everything comes from a single source, and therefore you have to reconcile and see the good in everything, including sex and the opposite sex and everything else which exists. You have to find some way to see its connection, however remote, to divinity, because nothing is truly evil, because everything comes from the same original source of reality. And so if something was truly evil, that would be a critique on divinity. It would be a statement that the divine was also evil. So you have to find some way to view everything as being inherently good. You find that tradition, in the East, and you find it in Buddhism and Jainism, and also in Hinduism. And here's how I got into that whole massive Jewish Christian freak out. Here's what it was for. We're generally accustomed to learning about different religions as discrete elements, like here's Judaism and here's Christianity. And we generally, even though it's right there in the Old and New Testament, we're generally not taught how one came from another and evolved from another, and where the points of connection and divergence are, how you got to a great divide like the Eastern and Western Church. We're not taught that stuff, but it's there. But if you want to learn that stuff, you have to, it's almost like we purposefully obfuscate that to try to show that we're different. But there's some exceptions. Like I said, the Muslims try to jump in and for marketing purposes. Schisms oftentimes like to align themselves with the parent tradition because it's better for marketing. You know what I mean? You're like, oh, do you like Hyundais? Yeah, okay, the Kia's like a Hyundai, but even better. It's from Korea. I don't know where Hyundais are from. Korea. They're also from Korea. It's like the alpha version. Like Hyundais are like the beta version. Kias are the alpha version. I don't know if that's the right term, but you get what I'm saying. It's 2.0. Kias are Hyundai 2.0s. You get it? Like you align yourself with something they have experience of, and then bump the hump and springboard off of that. But like when we look at Christianity and Judaism, what all you guys are going to have the most familiarity with, we really see them as two totally distinct traditions. Jews generally think Christians are weird and foolish, and that all their statements of having some kind of commonality with Judaism are just patently false, and it's just like a bunch of weirdos that like you had like an extra appendage that grew out of your hand or something like that. It had no value whatsoever. Right? Yeah. Right? And when Christians are like, well, we have this in common with you, and we have that in common, like, you know, that's not at all what we're saying. Like, you don't even, like, oh my God, like, that's like not at all what we meant. Like, you don't even know what you're talking about. So, although that's kind of how Jews and Christians think about each other. Oh, and the Jews, of course, the Christians, of course, think that the Jews killed Jesus. Christians have, over the last couple of millennia, been awful to Jewish people. And if you want to know why, it's because Christians, for a long time, have been promoting that the Jews killed Jesus. That whole like Jewish conspiracy and this and that, like Nazism and that whole thing, like where's that coming from? Study history. It's from the idea that the Jews killed Jesus, and therefore they're the ultimate evil people who denied the Messiah and got it wrong. So that, like, the Jews are like, you people are weird, and then the Christians are like, you people are actually evil, and we're going to genocidally wipe you out at various points in history and have pogroms. And I mean, you think of the Nazi, but there was a precursor to that. All over Russia, the Orthodox Church was doing these pogroms, wiping out entire villages of Jews. You can read about it. What to speak of, Muhammad himself writes that he personally beheaded 700 Jewish people, lined them up and just walked with his sword, just cut their heads off, and there was a river of blood. And his last wife was the wife of one of those guys, who he took as his own. According to the Islamic scholars, she willingly converted to Islam and was happy. But I think she was 9, so you can judge whether the person had agency at that age or not. Well, somehow I keep rising up and like cutting off half my head on the screen. In India, and with Buddhism, which is a schism of Hinduism, and with Hinduism, which is actually an umbrella term for hundreds of different faiths which coexisted in the Indian subcontinent, and with Jainism, an early sort of Buddhist type religion, precursor to Judaism, kind of equivalent to the Shraman, Cation traditions of the old Veda, if you're familiar with the history of ancient Indian religion. Cation means the wild-haired ones, and the Shramans are the people who performed tremendous austerities. They were on the periphery of the Vedic landscape, the ritual Vedic landscape. on the periphery of the ritual Vedic landscape. I'm just like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm making a mess here. Thank you. Thank you. On the periphery of the, I think we're good. No, you just did the same thing to me again. You just butchered my head. There we go. Thank you. All right. Yeah, there's actually no improvement, but that's okay. If I move even slightly, you cut my head off. We had it fixed, but then the camera dropped and you weren't able to fix it. It's okay. I'll survive. Anyway, there were these various ascetic movements on the periphery of the ritual Vedic landscape. They coexisted, and they're referenced in the time of the Rig Veda. But one thing you see in Eastern spirituality, Hinduism and Buddhism, and even the Jain tradition, and these traditions don't like each other. They don't like each other at all. They criticize. I mean, like the Dhammapada, kind of a classic text on Buddhism, the last chapter is, who's a Brahmin? The Buddha's like, oh, you think you're a Brahmin? I'm a real Brahmin. You're not a Brahmin. Like he's like imagine if the last chapter of the Bible was, who's a real Jew? Do you follow? It's super antagonistic, right? So don't mistake it. Buddhists and Hindus were strongly at odds with each other. But they borrowed from each other's philosophy freely and shamelessly. They didn't try to obfuscate it like the connections between Christianity and Judaism. It was a much more inclusivistic society with everything comes from one source monism as opposed to a radical dualism. In that sense, it was more like paganism and the monism that you find in paganism in indigenous Europe and such, where there was everything was ultimately connected to the divine in some way. And that more inclusive, everything comes from one source, I think allowed them to just sort of freely borrow from each other, and whenever somebody came up with a good idea, they would make it their own. And they would say, yeah, and they would quote the same language and have the same verses. And so something you find in Indian spirituality is you'll find ideas, rituals, practices, philosophy, which is common to multiple traditions, and the exact same verses show up in multiple traditions. And one phenomenal example of this is what's called the Brahma Vihar in Buddhism. The Brahma Vihar in Buddhism, which means the abodes of Brahman, but Vihar, although it also means play or leisure. It was originally the term in Sanskrit meant garden. A vihar was a garden. And so where people would enjoy and relax and play. And then in Buddhism, the word vihar became associated with an abode, a level of consciousness, and like a garden, which is was then a philosophical area that you would go to with your mind, and it would be a different way of viewing the world. Does that make sense? That might be, too much etymology for you guys, but that's where the term comes from. That's why you have words like Banki Bihari, which is a name for a deity of Krishna in Vrindavan. He's the enjoyer of the forest. Bana Bihari, the enjoyer of the forest. So that you actually find the same term Bihar used in the nomenclature associated with Krishna in our own tradition. Anyway, the Brahma Vihars. So Buddhism has these four things. It shows up in the Yoga Sutras. It shows up in the Jain literature as well. So you find there's four things. It shows up in all these traditions, and they more or less have the same verses in all four traditions. And Buddha even mentions it's a pre-existing thing that he's referencing. And he references in some ways in a good way, in some ways in a bad way, but he's referencing something which pre-existed that he freely borrowed from. And you find this kind of cross-pollination. You find that between Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism, where they were sharing ideas and best practices. And they would still find a way to critique each other. But if they found a good idea, if they found something of value, they would just borrow it They'd still find enough to criticize you for. It wasn't like, but there wasn't this idea that I have to wholly envision myself as being separate from you in order to make a comparison and a contrast. So these four things: mudita, joy; karuna, or compassion; maitri, friendship; and upeksha, or neglect. And in Buddhism, they have shamatha. It's like this kind of indifference. Upeksha turns into this indifference. Anyway, what I want to do today was I want to look at the way these four items are articulated in the Bhagavad Purana. So not only are these ideas there in Hinduism, they're actually there in our core text, the Bhagavad Purana. Like I said, they also show up in the Yoga Sutras and in the Buddhist literature and in the Jain literature. But this idea is so cool that it's there in the Bhagavatam itself, in a form which is very close to how you find it in the other traditions. And they all have just slightly different analysis of the four things and what those four things are in relationship to. It's an interesting... well, I think what we'll do is we'll go over the verse that I want to discuss in Sanskrit. I'll give you guys a real clean translation so you understand what we're talking about. And then I'll further explore the verse. You guys paying attention now? You saw that? So I randomly talked about Judaism and Christianity, but what I really want to talk about was the cross-pollination that happens between two different traditions and how it's largely obfuscated in the West, but it's there if you dig. Then I want to talk about how it's way more plain and on the surface in Eastern spirituality. And I wanted to highlight how there was an inclusivistic, non-civil war, not us versus them model that existed in ancient India up until the present moment. And then you had an opposite, much more tribal, Bedouin, kill your neighbors model in the Middle East. And that you find that like really well reflected in the spirituality of both groups. And so if you want to look at it from a sociological perspective, you see kind of evidence for why these two traditions might have viewed the world differently. And I want to throw in the idea of a radical dualism and the implications of that, where I have to really throw some stuff out. Monism, you have another challenge, which you have to find a way to incorporate everything. And then there was this real surface sharing of traditions which existed. And here's probably the strongest way in which you can see that sharing, is this concept of Brahma Vihar, which is a Buddhist term for something which pre-existed before Buddhism. And like I said, you find it in all manner of texts, including our own, including one of our deeper, kind of higher tier texts. Not a generic text like the Upanishads or the Gita, but something which is quite specific to our tradition. The Bhagavad Purana also has this idea in it. Here it is. Ishwade tat adineshu Bali sheshu dvisatsu cha. Okay, so this whole thing is a behavioral model of how you deal with different types of people. There is a cognitive component to it, because in Indic philosophy, the way you think about something also counts as a behavior. So there's a behavioral responses, responsive behavior, or a reaction, a response to different types of people has both a behavioral and a cognitive component. We normally break up, through humanism, we break up therapy into cognitive and behavioral therapy. Since the break from pure, in a lot of ways you could say that psychoanalytic theory is pure cognition, and behaviorism, like a la Skinner et al., that's like strong behaviorism. And those two things got merged by Abraham Maslow and his colleagues in the early 60s, and that became the humanist movement, and that became cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the standard model that's used these days in therapeutic circles. And that cognitive behavioral therapy model you try to reframe the way people think about the world with the idea that if you think about the world differently, you'll behave differently. And you also try to reframe their behavior, because you got to do that if they have some bad behavior, not just wait around for the cognition to kick in. But if you also modify their behavior, it'll also change the way they think about the world. It'll improve things, and you end up burning the candle at both ends to try to help somebody. Do you guys follow this? As opposed to a purely cognitive approach, which is what Freud got into and what the neo-Freudian philosophers got into, or a pure behavioral approach, which ignores the fact that we are thinking animals. We have huge, massive, encephalized brains, and we're capable of thought and recursion on a level that animals aren't, and therefore cognition is a really important feature of the human experience. And it has just a profound effect on our quality of life, and it's worthy of looking at more so than an animal that you maybe don't look at cognition so deeply. You treat them more as instinctual creatures. We are gifted with this ability to think about and talk about the world in a way animals can't, especially something called recursion. Noam Chomsky talked about I forget the name of it, the language acquisition tool, which is just human beings are capable of recursion. I can say, I'm going to the temple with my family for the program tonight and I can stack one prepositional phrase on top of another and make a very, very complicated sentence, and people know exactly what I'm talking about. We don't find that recursive language in any animal society, where just very, very sophisticated concepts can be easily communicated, even by a 3-year-old. I'm going to the temple, prepositional phrase, with my family, at this time, for this program, at this exact moment, in this car. Just one modification after another on the sentence, and it all makes sense. Did you follow that? That's something special about human beings. And so cognitive therapy actually recognizes that and celebrates that and utilizes it to the benefit of the people involved. Anyway, so from an Indic point of view, the way you think about something is in some ways a behavior. So they might describe it all as karma or behavior, but there's a cognitive and an actual physical component to that. Did you follow that? There's a way you respond to things cognitively and the way you respond to things physically. Viktor Frankl talked about this when he talked about the last vestige of human freedom and the fact that people could control your response, but they couldn't control how you chose to learn from what they did to you or how you chose to take what they did to you. He called it the last vestige of human freedom, the space between stimulus and response where you could decide how you would think about, how you would grow from whatever somebody subjected you to. He, of course, survived Auschwitz and lived to tell the tale and shared his thoughts about the freedom he discovered couldn't be taken away from him when everything else was. So the first 4 things are Ishware, to God. Ishware means to God. It's in what's called the Shasti Vibhakti. You turn Sanskrit into prepositional phrases by changing the suffix at the end. So if you want to say I'm going to the temple, you just say mandiram. Mandira means temple. Mandira means to the temple. And so by changing the suffix of a noun, you turn the noun into a prepositional phrase. Krishnena means with Krishna. Mandiram Krishnena, to the mandir with Krishna. So remember I mentioned recursive language? You can do that just by changing the suffix in Sanskrit. You don't have to introduce a prepositional phrase. You just change the suffix, and it does it already. So all of these are what's called Shasti Vibhakti, what's called the locative. And so language sometimes has this. It's called declension. Everybody knows how to conjugate verbs, change the suffix on verbs. To go is the infinitive, going, gone, will go, goes. You follow? That's how you change verbs. But then nouns can also be changed. The process of turning nouns into prepositional phrases is called declension. So these first 4 terms are declined to be in the locative. So Ishware, to Ishwar. Tad adineshu, to that which is subordinate to and connected to Ishwar, which is a fancy way of saying devotees. To God, to the devotees. Bali Sheshu, to the child, to children, to ignorant. It's a fancy way of saying fools. Balisha. You follow? He's a bacha. Like that. It's like the Sanskrit equivalent of that. Like a little boy, a fool, right? We say this in English. You'll say, like, what's your problem, boy? I mean, it's like if you said to a black person, it's super racist. But if you say it to somebody, the appropriate race for you, like you're allowed to say it to certain people. But if you call somebody a boy, it's an insult. You're saying to them, hey, you're my junior. It's not as bad as calling somebody a punk. If you guys are familiar with jail slang, because of course you all are. Where's my man? Is KD here?
No, he couldn't make it.
Okay, couldn't make it. All right. You call somebody a punk in prison, and they got to fight you. If you call somebody boy, it's kind of optional. You could respond back and call them some other derogatory term, or it could turn into a fight. It's kind of like a sub-automatic fight insult language. Anyway, the same term is there. Balisha. Balisheshu. Dvishatsu. Dvishatsu means to envious people. Dvisha, hateful people. Derisive people. So, to God, to God's devotees, to the ignorant, and to the envious. You follow? 4 kinds of people, and then you react in 4 ways. Prema, Maitri, Karuna, Upeksha, Yakaroti, Samadhyama. Yakaroti, one who does this. Samadhyama, he's in the middle, she's in the middle. This is a tripartite system of breaking down what level a devotee is at, whether they're a beginning devotee, a middle devotee, or an advanced devotee. Kanishta, Madhyam, or Uttama. And so this is occurring within that description of different types of devotees at different levels, and how to advance from one level to the next, like how to become an intermediate runner as opposed to a beginning runner, and how an intermediate cyclist, instead of a beginning cyclist. And so there's different things you do at different levels of your training. An intermediate yogi or yoga teacher versus a beginning yoga teacher. So there's certain things you'll advise people at the beginning of their career in doing something, whether it's a hobby or a career, or when somebody's first starting as an apprentice versus when they become a journeyman. A journeyman would be an intermediate level. A journeyman traditionally, you were paid every day. Jour, like soup du jour, soup of the day. So a journeyman in the traditional apprentice system in medieval Europe, you would apprentice for 7 years. You lived at the house of the master. They fed you, they clothed you, they taught you how to work. After 7 years, you became a journeyman, and you could then get paid for work, whereas when you were an apprentice, you didn't get paid. And then you had to travel for 3 to 5 years, and then sometimes longer, and then you had to study for many masters and produce a piece of master-level work, which was then examined by masters, and then they would approve it, and then you become a master. And once you became a master, you could then take on apprentices yourself or hire a journeyman and take on large projects. So this same terminology is still used, like if you become an electrician or a carpenter. You'll become a journeyman, and that means that you have a certain level. You can join the union, you've apprenticed, and now you're able to get union wages. Until you move from making $20 an hour as an apprentice to making $50 an hour or $70 an hour as a journeyman. You good?
Yeah.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a mid-level devotee. And it's the behaviors associated with a mid-level devotee. And the behaviors includes both a cognitive as well as a physical response. You follow this? Prema, Maitri, Karuna, Upeksha. 4 terms. Those are the Brahma Viharas. So towards Ishware, towards God, Ishwar, Prema, you give your love to God. Maitri, friendship, you give to the devotees. This is different than how it's recounted in Buddhism, which is Anishwar, has no concept of God. You follow? So they talk about the way you respond to pious and impious people and things like that. But one of the special ways in which this teaching was evolved or explored in our tradition was because we have a theistic model. Then part of what you're responding to is divinity. And love is for God, and then you become friends with the devotees. And then Bali Sheshu, for Balisha, you are Kripa, you give mercy. It's kind of a more intense form of Karuna. Karuna means compassion. Kripa is the same, it's a synonym, but it's kind of more intense. You give them mercy. So you help those people who are ignorant. And Upeksha is actually the whole class was to talk about Upeksha, but I'm looking at the clock and I'm realizing I went too big on my intro, and so we'll probably have to just cram it all into the last 5 minutes. Dvisha, those people who are hateful. Upeksha, you ignore them. Upeksha means to overlook them, but from upa and iksh, but what it literally means is it means you neglect them. You overlook them like you don't acknowledge their existence. Like you look over their head and just don't pay them any mind. There's a practical benefit to this, in that if you look somebody in the eyes who's in a bad space, you're going to start a fight with them. They're going to get angry at you. Some people are like, good morning. Like, is it good morning? Is it good? How do you know it's good? How do you know what I've been through? How dare you speak like that to me? You know? Or they just break down crying. You look at them and they just start bawling their eyes out and telling you their life story. And it's you're performing surgery or something like that, and you're like, listen, nurse, I'm sorry that you had a bad day, but we got to talk about this after the patient's off the table. It's a bit narcissistic to just make it all about you all day, every day. We got somebody on the table. So there's a practical benefit to sometimes keeping people cool by just not engaging. At the same time, sometimes if you engage too much, it drags you down. You might not have developed the ability to keep your head above the fray. And so sometimes if you get into it with somebody too much, it drags you down. Maybe you're a recovering drug addict, and then somebody who's a drug addict themselves wants to come to you and show you their drug paraphernalia and talk to you at length about their drug use, and it spins you out, and then now you got your whole thing going on in your head that's bumming you out. You're trying to be celibate, you're hanging out with a bunch of people and they're talking about how lusty they are. They're looking at attractive people and calling out their body parts and getting all spun out and gross and doggish. And then you got to deal with that, and you're trying to be celibate. It's like at the very least it grosses you out, and at worst it kind of makes it more tough for you to do what you want to do. So there's sometimes a benefit to you to keeping a little bit aloof from certain people. There's sometimes a benefit to those people. But this is a real underexplored, we champion people who are heroic and courageous and leap into the fray and dive on the grenade. There's a whole hero complex in the U.S. Our firemen and police officers die at way higher rates than firemen and police officers in Switzerland. Way higher rates. Because they're willing to run into a burning building to save a kid. And we don't save any additional people compared to a country like Switzerland. Our firemen will run into a burning building when it's unsafe, not save the kid, die themselves. Whereas in other countries that have less of this John Wayne, rugged individualist, cowboy ethos, they're just well-trained firemen and look at the structure of the building and call in support and cut the appropriate breaks in the building and figure out how to safely get people out without killing themselves unnecessarily in the process. And so they end up saving more people and dying less. You follow? That sucks. Like, no, like you guys all look depressed hearing that because you're like, yeah, we save them and we die. But then when we find out you're stupid, you don't save them and you die because you're an idiot. You're actually like you're just like have a death wish. You're just an idiot. There's no value to your valor. It's valueless valor. You follow? So sometimes being a little detached, being a little aloof, allows you to be more surgical in your engagement with people. It allows you to help people better, to know what your limits are, to recoup, take some time for yourself, to recover, to recreate recreation time so you can recharge your batteries and come back in fresh. At a certain point, you start to perform at a really subpar level. And even if you want to stay there and perform surgeries, for 48 straight hours because there's some kind of massive accident, you might end up killing more people on the table than if you went and caught a couple hours of sleep somewhere. And so that ability to detach, that ability to walk away, that ability to let go is part of wisdom. A part of wisdom that's largely unexplored amongst lay people. And in a lot of ways, it's the line of demarcation between the ascetics of a tradition and the lay people. The lay people are generally better at activism, they're better at social movements, and they of course they make up the majority of any tradition, the congregation. But the ascetics of a tradition, the renunciates of a tradition, in one way, the way you demarcate them from the congregation is in their ability to manifest detachment. Which has value. And of course, how do you become detached in our tradition? Well, you fall in love with Krishna. And by falling in love with Krishna and making friendship with the other lovers of Krishna, you're then able to let go of and be surgically involved in dealing with the rest of the world. And you basically deal with the rest of the world in two ways. One way is you uplift people. And the other one is you avoid people when you can't uplift them. The first two are about your nourishment. You love God and become best friends with the devotees. And that's powerful. That has a powerful curative effect on the soul. I don't have any non-devotee friends. I got a couple. They're guys I wrestle with, and somehow you wrestle with somebody and it creates some intimacy, Somehow. It's like it creates an intimacy. I'm generally a little bit of a clean freak, but if I'm wrestling and I'm like somebody's leg hair gets in my mouth, I'm like, okay, let's get back to it. Or they like, you're sweating and somebody's sweat drips in your mouth. You're like, shake it off. Don't think about it. Like there's no version of reality or any other circumstance anywhere in reality where like some dude would sweat and it would drip into my mouth and I wouldn't vomit. Other than on the wrestling match where it's like at most a minor inconvenience. And there's a certain camaraderie. And, wrestling essentially is like basically like war. One-on-one personal combat, but nobody dies. And so, you've been training? And so, for the most part, over the last 32 years, my only friends are devotees. How can I be super close to somebody who doesn't love Krishna? Krishna is the most important thing to me. It's the dearest thing to me. It's the heart of my heart. It's the sanctum sanctorum of my heart. How can I get close to somebody I can't share that with? Like the most important thing in my life, the thing I've dedicated my entire life to, the thing I do every day, for hours a day, what's always on my mind how can I really have an intimate relationship with somebody who I don't share that with? Some people are better compartmentalizing, they're like, my wife is a Jew and I'm a Muslim and we just don't talk religion at the dinner table. I'm not like even faulting that, but for me personally, it's like, it just doesn't work. I'm looking for holism in my life. And the people I'm close to, I want to have things in common with. And so the devotees are my best friends because I share the most with them. And by having devotees around me, I'm kept pious. If I go off the beaten path, they push me back towards the center. They're my friends, philosophers, and guides. My elders, my friends, my juniors. There's value in all three of those relationships. I uplift people, so I got to be good, so I can uplift people, I'm sharp, so I can help them. And then the people that I'm arm in arm with, my contemporaries, I'm inspired by them, they're inspired by me, and we push each other to be our best self. And then my elders are constantly setting a superlative example for me and giving me invaluable guidance because they've walked the path before me. Just loving God's not enough. You love God and you make friends with the devotees. And that combination is powerful, uplifting, fills your cup. And then detachment becomes an automatic byproduct of that. We don't just cultivate detachment for its own sake as some sort of Zen ideal, some sort of Buddhist ideal that we introduce based on the fact that the entire material world is temporary, useless, and leads only to suffering, and therefore the best thing you can do is to stoically respond to the world by being detached. That's not our program. We got all that detachment in spades. We got it. But where do we get it from? Because we love Krishna. So much so that we're chaste, that we're sober, that we're faithful, that we keep it sharp. Our observance of our vows, our observance of our austerities, our ability to perform tremendous austerities and sublimate our selfish desires for a higher purpose and to transcend lower desires is because our cup is so filled with the best ambrosia, the best elixir, the best thing that could ever exist, that letting go of the low stuff becomes easy. First it becomes possible, then it becomes easy, then it becomes automatic. And so it's interesting, it starts off with your relationship with divinity, and then right away with the devotees, who are a practical manifestation of your love for divinity, is your closeness to those people who also love the thing you love. And then that enables you to deal with the outside world in two ways, both of which are uplifting. One is to directly uplift somebody, and the other one is to leave them be so that you're at least not damaging them, because they're in a space where any interaction is going to be a negative one. Anyway, I had a whole class to give on these verses and Upeksha and the interplay. I at least wanted to honor it like on a small level, but there it is. Western and Eastern spirituality, the essence of religion, how religions start, the Mosaic Abrahamic tradition, how it bled into Christianity even though people don't notice it, schisms versus revival movements, dualism versus monism, Eastern and Western spirituality, the sociology behind both of them, the natural and easy and straightforward cross-pollination of different spiritual traditions in ancient India, and one example of it in the Brahma Vihar, and how that Brahma Vihar manifests in our tradition, and exploring a single verse in a little bit of detail so you guys will get a chance, and then a basic exposition of that verse. Thank you very much for joining us on IGTV. And thank you very much for joining us on Facebook. Until next time. Give me some feedback, guys. Yeah, what do you got?
One detail that stood out was that you mentioned that the European pagans were monistic.
Yeah.
But did they have a concept of like a capital G God, like their Indo-European root?
No. Monism is the idea